Ever get stuck on, like, the idea of God's
Oh,
love?
yeah, for sure. It's a big one.
It can feel kind of distant sometimes,
Hmm.
right? At least it does for me. Like, how do we even wrap our heads around something that massive?
Right. Like, what does that even look like practically?
Well, that's what I want to dive into today. I was reading this excerpt from Gary Matthews, and he had this take on divine love that really got me thinking.
Oh, cool. What's his angle?
He uses this analogy of a parent's love. You know, like that fierce, unconditional thing a parent has for their kid, no matter what they do.
Okay, yeah.
Even when the kid's totally clueless, messing up, the parent's love is still there. He says it's like a glimpse, just a tiny one, into the kind of love God has for us.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. We all get that, right? Like, even if you're not a parent, you've experienced that kind of love.
Yeah, totally. Like it just is. No strings attached.
Right.
And Matthew's saying that's how God's love works too, only, well, infinitely bigger.
That makes it a little less intimidating, I guess. Because sometimes that whole God's love thing can feel overwhelming. Like, how do we even measure up?
I know, right? There have been times when I felt so disconnected. Like, do I even deserve this kind of love?
Yeah, me too. But what I like about this whole parent-child analogy is it kind of takes the pressure off, you know? It's not about earning it, it's just there.
It just is. And that's a huge relief.
Exactly. That's what Matthews is getting at. We tend to think of love in this kind of transactional way, right? Like, you do this, you get that. But divine love, he's saying, it doesn't work like that at all.
Which brings us to this other idea that blew my mind. Matthews call it timeless love. He actually says, quote, timeless love is his heartbeat. What do you think he means by that?
Well, that's where things get kind of trippy. We experience time in a very linear way, right? Past,
Hmm.
present, future. It's how we make sense of the world.
Right.
But a lot of theologians argue that God exists outside of that framework, outside of time as we understand it.
So are we talking about eternity here?
Kind of, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. Eternity is often seen as like time going on forever.
Okay.
But Matthews is suggesting something deeper, a state where time, like the way we measure it, just doesn't apply.
Whoa.
And that has huge implications for how we understand God's love.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But how does love actually exist outside of time?
It's hard to wrap our heads around, right?
Uh-huh.
Because we're so stuck in this linear way of thinking. But imagine a love that isn't bound by past, present, or future. It's just fully present in every single moment.
Okay, so then our past regrets, our anxieties about the future, those wouldn't even factor in.
Exactly. It's a love that's not diminished by anything we've done or worried about what might happen. It just is pure, untainted, complete.
That's pretty powerful.
Right. And he talks about forgiveness as like a key example of timeless love.
Oh, interesting.
He's saying that because God isn't bound by our linear timeline, forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's more about absorbing it.
So not forgetting what happened, but seeing it from a totally different perspective, one that's not limited by our human idea of time.
Exactly. And it kind of ties back to that parent-child analogy, right? A good parent doesn't stop loving their kid just because they screw up. They see beyond the mistake. They have this bigger picture of who that child is.
I like that.
Yeah, and Matthews argues that God sees us in the same way. He sees all of who we are, past, present, and future, and loves us completely.
Man, there's a lot to unpack here.
Right.
There's this one other thing I wanted to touch on. Matthews talks about the moment of death, and he describes it not as an ending, but as this transition into a state of pure, timeless love. Does that connect to what we've been talking about?
Absolutely. I think he's getting at the fact that our fear of death stems from our limited understanding of time. We see it as the end, the ultimate unknown.
Yeah.
But if God's love is truly timeless, then death isn't an ending. It's more like a merging with that love, a shedding of those limitations we've been talking about.
So it's not about ceasing to exist, but about experiencing that love in its fullness.
Yes. And it's actually a really comforting thought when you think about it. If we can let go of that fear of the unknown and embrace this idea of timeless love, it changes everything.
It definitely reframes how we see our own mortality.
Totally. And that's what's so great about Matthew's work. He's not afraid to tackle these big questions about life, death, and eternity. He pushes us to consider possibilities that we might not have thought of before.
So after this deep dive, what's the main thing you hope listeners take away from all this?
I think Matthew's main point is that we need to keep exploring, to sit with these ideas and let them really sink in, to ask ourselves how this concept of timeless love can change how we live, how we love, how we face our fears.
It's a pretty profound thought to carry with us.
No.
Like if we could really grasp that timeless, boundless love, how would that change how we treat each other? how we approach our own lives?
That's the question he leaves us with, and it's definitely one worth pondering long after we're done with this deep dive.
Absolutely. Lots to think about. Thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Always good to chat.